A finger can end a marriage before the vows are even said, or it can be the thing that finally proves who someone really is. Don Salvatore Caruso's finger was still trembling an inch from Sofia Marchetti's lips, his voice still ringing off the marble and gold of the Caruso ballroom, when the color drained out of his face, because his son had just crossed the room, taken her hand in front of 200 witnesses and said the only words that mattered, "She's the reason I'm alive." Rewind 6 months. Sofia Marchetti was 26, and the closest thing she had to a social life was the vending machine on the 3rd floor of Lenox Presbyterian. She worked doubles most weeks, not because the hospital demanded it, but because her mother's chemotherapy didn't care what Sofia could afford. Rent, co-pays, the specialist who only took cash. The math never worked unless Sofia added more hours to a day that already had none to spare. She'd stopped noticing her own exhaustion, the way you stop noticing a bruise you press on out of habit. She'd also stopped expecting to be looked at twice, not by co-workers rushing past her in the hallway, not by men at the bus stop, not by anyone. Somewhere in the last few years, she'd made a quiet peace with being the person in the room nobody remembered. It didn't hurt anymore most days. It was just a fact about her life, like her shift schedule or her shoe size, which was exactly why nothing about that Tuesday night felt like it belonged to her. It was almost 1 in the morning when she got home, rain coming down in that cold, relentless way November rain does in New York, soaking through her scrubs before she even reached her building's front steps. She noticed the sedan first, black, engine running, parked crooked against the curb like whoever was driving it hadn't planned on stopping long. Then she noticed the 2 men getting out of it. Then she noticed what they were dragging out of the back seat. They dropped him on the sidewalk the way you'd drop something you'd already decided wasn't your problem anymore. No hesitation, no glance backward. The car pulled away before Sofia had even processed what she was looking at. Taillights swallowed by the rain within seconds. She knew 2 things in the space of a single heartbeat. The man bleeding into the pavement in front of her wouldn't survive an ambulance ride, and there was no version of tonight where she simply walked past him and went inside. 11 years of ER training doesn't turn off just because you're off the clock. She crouched beside him, hands already moving, checking his pulse, finding the wound low on his abdomen, recognizing in an instant that whatever this was, it wasn't survivable without immediate pressure and level of intervention no sidewalk in Queens could offer. He was maybe 30, maybe younger, dark hair plastered to his forehead, jaw clenched hard against pain he wasn't making a sound about. Even half-conscious and losing blood by the second, there was something deliberate in the way he held himself. Controlled, like even dying. He refused to look like a man who was dying. Sofia didn't think about who he was. She didn't think about the black sedan, or the men who dumped him, or what kind of trouble came wrapped in a coat that expensive. She thought about the 4 flights of stairs between the sidewalk and her apartment, and whether she could get him up them before he bled out in her arms. She got him up 2 flights instead. Her unit was on the 2nd floor, and 2 flights were 2 flights too many already. She laid him across her kitchen table because it was the flattest surface she owned, ripped open the emergency kit she kept for reasons she'd never examined too closely, and did something no nurse is supposed to do without a license number attached to the decision. She used supplies she'd quietly taken from the hospital over the years. The kind of small thefts you tell yourself you'll never actually need. She worked by the light over her stove because her overhead bulb had burned out weeks ago, and she still hadn't replaced it. She worked until her hands stopped shaking on their own and started shaking for a different reason, because the worst of it was behind her and her body needed somewhere to put all the adrenaline it had been running on. Somewhere in that hour, the stranger's breathing steadied. Somewhere in that hour, Sofia Marchetti saved a man's life on the same table where she usually ate cereal standing up before her shift, and never once thought to ask him his name. She should have called someone. She knew that, even in the moment, knew that whatever this was, it was above her, outside the boundaries of what one exhausted ER nurse should be handling alone in a 1-bedroom apartment at 2 in the morning. But something about the stillness in his face, even bleeding, even unconscious, told her that calling anyone would be the wrong kind of help, so she didn't. She sat in the chair across from her own kitchen table and watched a stranger breathe, and didn't sleep, not really, until the grey light of dawn came through her blinds. That was when his hand closed around her wrist. His eyes were open, clear. sharper than they had any right to be, for a man who'd been bleeding out 12 hours earlier. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask where he was or how, or why a stranger's hands had been the ones to save him. He just held her wrist, steady and firm, and looked at her with an intensity that made the exhaustion in her chest go very quiet. "Forget my face," he said, voice low and rough from disuse. "Forget this night ever happened. If the wrong people find out what you did for me, it won't just be your life on the line." And then before Sophia could find a single word to answer him with, he was gone, out the window fire escape into a city that swallowed him whole, leaving nothing behind but a heavy signet ring pressed into her palm, and a warning she wouldn't understand the full weight of for another 6 months. She never got his name. She never got an explanation. What she got, instead, was a life that quietly folded itself back into its old shape. The shifts, the hospital bills, her mother's failing color, as if the strangest night of her life had simply never happened. But some nights don't stay buried, and 6 months later, in a ballroom full of strangers who'd already decided what kind of woman she was, Sophia was about to find out exactly who she'd saved, and exactly what it would cost her to be seen. The grey light through Sophia's blinds hadn't fully broken into morning when she felt the shift in the room, not a sound exactly, more a change in the air. The particular stillness of someone who has just realized they're being watched. She'd meant to stay awake. She remembered promising herself that somewhere around 4 a.m. Mina slumped in the kitchen chair with her knees pulled to her chest, but 11 years of double shifts had trained her body to sleep the second it sensed permission, and her body had apparently decided this counted. She woke to find him watching her. He hadn't moved from the table, but he was sitting up now, one hand pressed flat against the bandage at his side, his color better than it had any right to be 12 hours after losing that much blood. His eyes were dark, alert, and doing something Sophia hadn't expected, cataloging her, not the way men usually looked at her, which was to say, barely at all. He was studying her the way you'd study a locked door you weren't sure you trusted. "You should be in a hospital," Sophia said, because it was true, and because it was easier than asking any of the questions actually crowding her throat. "No," he said, just that, flat, final, not unkind. She sat up straighter, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. "You lost a lot of blood. If that wound reopens, it won't." He said it like a fact he'd already decided, the same tone he'd probably used to decide most things in his life. He glanced down at the makeshift dressing she'd built out of gauze and kitchen towels, then back at her, and for a moment something in his expression flickered. Not gratitude exactly, something quieter and more private than that. "You did this yourself. I'm a nurse. Nurses don't operate on kitchen tables. They do when the alternative is watching someone die on a sidewalk." He didn't answer that. He just kept looking at her, and Sophia felt the full strangeness of the moment settle over her. A stranger bare-chested and bandaged, sitting at her kitchen table at dawn, studying her like she was a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve. She should have been afraid. Some small, sensible part of her was, but mostly she was tired, and mostly she wanted answers. "What's your name?" "Doesn't matter. You're in my apartment. You dragged me here." A ghost of something crossed his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I didn't exactly send an invitation." "Fine. Then who were the men who did this to you?" His jaw tightened, just slightly. The first genuine crack she'd seen in the composure he wore like a second skin. "That's a question you don't want answered." "I think I've earned an answer." "You've earned my thanks," he said, and something in his voice dropped lower, rougher, more honest than anything he'd said yet. "Which is exactly why I'm not going to give you anything else. The less you know, the safer you are." Sophia opened her mouth to argue. She was good at arguing with exhausted attendings twice her age. She wasn't going to be talked down by a man she'd met 12 hours ago, bleeding on a sidewalk. But something in his face stopped her. It wasn't threat. It was closer to warning, the kind you give someone you're actually trying to protect. And that distinction landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to. He stood, testing his weight, steadier than he should have been. He was already reaching for the ruined, blood-stiff shirt draped over her kitchen chair, when he paused, looking at her again with that same cataloging intensity. Except this time, it wasn't suspicion. It was something closer to recognition, like he was seeing a species of person he hadn't encountered in a long time. People who helped without calculating what it cost them. People who didn't ask what's in it for me before they acted. Most people, he said quietly, would have called someone, or run, or both. Most people, Sophia said, aren't ER nurses. That's not what I mean. He held her gaze a second longer than comfortable, then broke it, reaching into his coat pocket instead. He pulled out a heavy gold ring, a signet stamped with a crest she didn't recognize, and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it with a grip that was gentle but absolute. What is this? Insurance. If anyone ever comes asking questions about tonight, about me, you show them this and you say nothing else. You understand? His eyes held hers, dead serious now, all the softness from a moment ago gone. Forget my face. Forget this night. If the wrong people find out you saved me, it won't just be your life on the line. That's not exactly reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to keep you alive. And then, before she could ask anything else, before she could even fully process the ring cooling against her palm, he was moving toward the fire escape, wincing once as the motion pulled at his wound. And then he was gone, swallowed by the grey morning, the same way the black sedan had disappeared into the rain 12 hours earlier. Sophia sat alone in her kitchen for a long time after that, the ring heavy in her hand, the blood still faintly staining the grain of her table, no matter how hard she'd scrubbed at 3 a.m. She told herself she'd think about it later, process it, make sense of it, maybe even be frightened by it properly. But later never came, because later was swallowed by the same grinding routine that swallowed every day of her life. Her shift started at 7. Her mother had an appointment at 11 she needed a ride to. There was a stack of unpaid bills on the counter that weren't going to unstack themselves. So Sophia did the only thing she knew how to do with things too large to carry. She buried it. The ring went into an old tin at the back of her closet, tucked beneath a photograph of her father in his white coat, and the strange, bleeding stranger who'd once gripped her wrist like a lifeline went into the part of her mind reserved for things she didn't have the bandwidth to feel. She didn't think that grey morning to wonder why his driver, a wiry, watchful man she'd catch only a glimpse of weeks later waiting in a car 2 blocks from her building, had chosen her street at all. Out of every street in the city, she didn't know yet that her late father, years before his own heart gave out, had once treated a desperate young man named Marco off the books. No questions asked. The kind of quiet kindness her father had built his whole reputation on. She didn't know that debt had a memory longer than she did. She just went back to work and tried for 6 months to forget. 6 months is a long time to carry a secret and a short time to change a life. By the following spring, Sophia's days had folded back into their familiar shape. 12-hour shifts, her mother's slow decline measured out in appointment after appointment. The tin at the back of her closet she never opened but always knew was there. The ring had become something like a scar. She didn't think about it often, but she never quite forgot. It was under the skin. The email came on a Thursday, buried between a shift change notice and a reminder about flu shot compliance. Caruso Wintour engagement celebration. Hospital staff invitation. Sophia almost deleted it without reading past the subject line. She got a lot of emails she had no intention of opening. "You're not seriously going to skip this," said Denise, leaning over the nurse's station with the particular energy of a woman who had already decided the answer for both of them. "Skip what?" "The party, Sophia. Wintour's daughter is marrying into money. Real money. And apparently her fiancé's family is thanking the hospital staff who took care of her grandmother last year. Which means us. Which means an open bar and a string quartet. And probably food I can't pronounce." Sophia scrolled through the email properly this time. Hospital administrator Richard Wintour's daughter engaged to a man named Vittorio, whose family, the invitation said with a kind of understated grandeur that made Sophia's stomach tighten slightly, though she couldn't have said why, was hosting the celebration at their private estate on the Hudson. Formal attire requested. Transportation provided. "I don't have anything to wear to something like this," Sophia said, which was true. And which was also easier to say out loud than "I don't have the energy" or "I don't know how to exist in a room like that." "You have the navy dress, the one from your cousin's wedding. That was 3 years ago. It'll still fit you. You've been running yourself into the ground, not the other way around." Denise's voice softened. just slightly, in the way it did when she was worried about Sophia and trying not to make a thing of it. You haven't had a night off in, I don't even know how long. Your mum's stable this week. Let your aunt sit with her for once. Come with me. One night. You don't even have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. Sophia thought about saying no. It would have been easy. The reflex was right there, worn smooth from years of use. I can't. I have a shift. I have my mother. I don't have the energy to be looked at by people I don't know. But something about the exhaustion in her own bones, the particular kind that comes from months of holding everything together and never once being held, made her hesitate. One night, she said finally. The estate, when the hired car pulled through its gates 2 weeks later, was not what Sophia had pictured. She'd imagined something like a wedding venue. Big, expensive, impersonal. What she found instead was closer to a palace, a sweeping stone facade lit gold against the dark, a driveway lined with more luxury cars than she'd seen collectively in her entire life, and a ballroom entrance flanked by white roses arranged with a precision that made her feel immediately and completely like she'd worn the wrong dress. "Denise," she murmured, staring up at the chandeliers visible through the tall windows. "Who exactly are these people?" "Wintour's future-in-laws," Denise said, tugging her toward the entrance before Sophia's nerve could fail her. "I heard there's some kind of real estate family. Old money. Very private." Sophia didn't know the name Caruso. She didn't know it the way most of Chicago knew Russo, or the way certain circles in New York knew families whose business dealings were never quite explained in the papers. She only knew that the man greeting guests at the door wore a suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent, and that everyone around her seemed to move with the specific fluency of people who had never once wondered if they belonged somewhere. Oh! Gold light spilled from 3 enormous chandeliers, catching on champagne flutes and diamond earrings, and the 100 small, glittering details Sophia had no context for. A string quartet played something she half recognized from a movie she couldn't place. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with trays of food she genuinely couldn't identify. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely, achingly visible. Not because anyone was looking at her, but because she was suddenly, painfully aware of every way she didn't fit the frame. Her navy dress, which had felt perfectly respectable in her bedroom mirror, now felt like something borrowed from a different decade. She smoothed the fabric at her hips, an old habit she thought she'd broken, and hovered near the edge of the room while Denise disappeared into the crowd, chasing a tray of something that smelled like truffle. Sophia told herself she'd give it 20 minutes. Long enough to be polite, short enough to escape before anyone noticed she was standing alone near the entrance, like a woman waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. She had no idea, standing there in the gold light with a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, that somewhere in that same house was the man whose blood she'd once scrubbed out of her kitchen table grout. She had no idea that the ring buried in a tin at the back of her closet shared a crest with half the silverware in this room. She had no idea that the family she'd stumbled into, uninvited by blood and unaware by circumstance, was the same family whose secrets she was already unknowingly keeping. What she did notice, because it was impossible not to, was the older man near the far end of the room, gray-haired and posing, moving through the crowd with the particular gravity of someone everyone else instinctively made space for. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Every conversation near him seemed to straighten slightly, the way plants lean toward light out of some instinct they can't name. Sophia watched him for a moment too long, and that was her mistake, because when Don Salvatore Caruso's gaze swept the edges of his own ballroom, cataloging his guests his allies, the small army of people whose loyalty had been bought or born into, it snagged on the woman standing alone near the entrance, in a 3-year-old dress, watching him with an expression he read instantly, and without a shred of doubt as calculation. He knew every face that belonged in this room. He did not know hers. And there was only one kind of woman in Salvatore Caruso's experience who stood alone at the edge of a party like this, watching the family with that particular hungry stillness. The kind chasing a name, a fortune, a son who wasn't hers to chase. His expression hardened. He set down his glass, and he began walking toward her, contempt already settling into the lines of his face like something he'd worn 1,000 times before, and was more than ready to wear again. Sophia didn't notice him approaching until he was already close enough that stepping away would have looked like fleeing. and something in her, the same stubborn instinct that kept her on her feet through 16-hour shifts, refused to give him the satisfaction of watching her retreat. "You're not on my list," Salvatore said, without preamble, without introduction. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I'm sorry. The guest list. I know every name on it." His eyes moved over her, slow and deliberate, cataloguing the navy dress, the department store shoes, the way she stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, like she was trying to take up less room than she already did. Something in his expression curdled further with every second of that inventory. "And I don't know yours." "On hospital staff," Sophia said, keeping her voice level even as her pulse climbed. "We were invited. I have the email. Hospital staff." He said it like the words tasted wrong in his mouth. Of course, that's the story. A few nearby conversations had already begun to quiet. Guests drawn by the particular gravity that followed Salvatore Caruso through any room he occupied. Sophia felt the shift before she understood it, the way attention gathers like weather, pressure building before anyone says a word. She wanted, more than anything, to simply produce the invitation and end this. But some old, tired part of her recognized that a man like this wasn't looking for proof. He'd already decided the shape of the story he wanted to tell. "Let me guess," Salvatore continued, louder now, deliberately louder, angling his voice toward the small crowd that had begun to form around them like something drawn to a spill. "You heard there was a Caruso son in this house tonight. Unmarried, worth more than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. And you thought, why not? Why not put on your best dress?" His eyes flicked over the navy fabric with open disdain, "and see if you can corner him somewhere quiet." A ripple of laughter, uneasy at first, then bolder as more guests turned to watch. "That's not," Sophia started. "Look at yourself." His voice dropped somehow crueler for the quiet. The finger he raised now aimed almost at her chin, close enough that she could smell the scotch on his breath. "You think a man like my son looks twice at a woman like you? Too plain for the cameras, too heavy for the dress you're wearing. Standing here like you belong in a room you clearly wasted money getting into." He straightened, addressing the gathering crowd now more than her, performing for them the way a man performs when he knows he has an audience that will laugh on cue. This is what desperation looks like. A woman with nothing chasing a name that isn't hers to chase. The laughter came fuller this time, the ugly kind, the kind that spreads because no one wants to be the one who doesn't join in. Sophia felt her face go hot, felt the old familiar shrinking sensation crawl up her spine, the one she'd spent years learning to hide, the one that made her want to become as small and unremarkable as the world had always told her she already was. 200 strangers were laughing at a story that wasn't true, told by a man who hadn't asked her a single real question. And the worst part, the part that made her throat tighten, was that some small, exhausted piece of her almost believed she deserved it. That maybe standing in this room, in this dress, hoping for one night that didn't feel like survival, had been its own kind of foolishness. But she didn't correct him. She didn't explain that she had no idea who his son even was, that she wasn't chasing anyone's name, that she'd almost stayed home to sit with her dying mother instead of coming here at all. Some instinct, pride or exhaustion, or simply the recognition that nothing she said would matter to a man who'd already made up his mind, kept her silent. She stood there, spine straight, chin level, and let him say what he needed to say, refusing only to give him the tears he seemed to be angling for. "Plain, heavy-set, nothing," Salvatore said, savoring the final word like he'd been building to it the whole time, his finger still raised, still trembling an inch from her lips with contempt. "That's what you are to this family, a nobody who wandered in the wrong door." The room had gone almost entirely silent now, waiting, the way a crowd waits for the last beat of a performance it's already decided to enjoy. That was the exact moment the far doors opened. Sophia didn't see him at first. Her eyes were fixed somewhere past Salvatore's shoulder, on the middle distance, the place people look when they're trying not to look at anything at all. But she felt the room change before she understood why, felt the crowd's attention split and redirect, a current shifting direction all at once. She turned, finally, toward the doors, and felt the floor tilt beneath her. He was dressed differently than the last time she'd seen him. Sharper, cleaner, a charcoal suit replacing the blood-soaked shirt she remembered scrubbing out of her sink. But it was him, The same dark eyes, the same stillness, the same face that had watched her from her kitchen table at dawn 6 months ago and told her to forget it ever happened. He had gone rigid in the doorway. His gaze moved from Salvatore's raised finger to Sophia's face, and something in his expression cracked open. Recognition, disbelief, and underneath it, a fury so immediate and total that the temperature of the room seemed to drop around him. Vittorio, Salvatore started, already turning, already reaching for whatever explanation he'd planned to give his son about the uninvited woman he'd just finished humiliating. But Vittorio wasn't looking at his father anymore. He was crossing the ballroom floor in long, deliberate strides, guests parting instinctively out of his path, and Sophia had time for exactly one thought. He knows me. He actually knows me. Before he reached her, took her hand in both of his, and turned to face the room, and his father and the finger still hovering an inch from her lips. The silence that followed was absolute. She's the reason I'm alive. For a long moment, no one in the ballroom moved. 200 guests stood frozen in various states of half-finished laughter, champagne flutes hanging forgotten in their hands, while the words, "She's the reason I'm alive," settled over the room like something too heavy to hold. Salvatore's finger was still raised. Slowly, as if his own arm had betrayed him without his permission, it dropped to his side. His face, moments ago flushed with the particular satisfaction of a man enjoying his own cruelty, had drained to something gray and unfamiliar. He looked at his son's hand wrapped around Sophia's, then at Sophia's face, really looked at it this time, and Sophia watched something shift behind his eyes as pieces he didn't yet understand began, painfully, to assemble themselves. "Vittorio," he said again, quieter now, stripped of its earlier command. "What is this?" "Not here," Vittorio said, and the flatness in his voice was worse than shouting would have been. He turned, still holding Sophia's hand like he was afraid she might dissolve if he let go, and guided her through the parting crowd toward a set of doors along the ballroom's east wall. Sophia went with him, numb, aware only distantly of 200 pairs of eyes following her exit, of Denise's stunned face somewhere in the crowd, of the strange floating sensation of being simultaneously the most humiliated and most protected she had ever felt in a single hour. The room beyond the doors was a private study, dark wood, a cold fireplace, the kind of hush that only exists in houses built to keep secrets in separate rooms from the people meant to hear them. Vittorio closed the door behind them and finally let go of her hand, only to run his own through his hair, exhaling like a man setting down something he'd been carrying too long. "I owe you an explanation," he said. 6 months of one, actually. "You could start," Sophia said, her voice steadier than she felt, "with why the men who dumped you outside my building didn't take you to a hospital or to anyone your family trusted. Because that was the point." Vittoria's jaw tightened. "Whoever put a bullet in me wanted it to look like a rival hit. Clean, external, deniable. If I'd ended up in a hospital, or in the hands of any doctor my family knew, there would have been questions asked by people loyal to whoever did this. Questions that would have led somewhere it wasn't supposed to lead. Which was where." Vittorio was quiet for a moment, choosing the words like they cost him something. "Bruno Ricci, my father's consigliere, a man who has sat at our table since before I was born, who I called uncle until I was old enough to know better than to call anyone that." His voice hardened. "He orchestrated it, staged an attack that looked like it came from the Moretti family, so no one would look at the man standing closest to my father, closest to me. He wanted it to look like the Morettis were making a move on Caruso blood. He wanted a war that would put every eye in this city somewhere else while he positioned his own son to inherit what should have been mine." Sophia sat slowly on the arm of a leather chair, the weight of it settling into her chest. "And your driver brought you to me because Marco trusted almost no one inside my father's reach that night, and he needed somewhere the family's loyal men wouldn't think to look." Vittorio's expression softened, just slightly, the anger giving way to something closer to gratitude. "Your father treated him once, years ago, off the books, no questions, no bill he couldn't afford. Marco never forgot it. When he saw me bleeding out in the back seat and didn't know which of our own men he could trust with my life. Your building was the only address that came to mind that wasn't tied to the Carusos at all." Sophia thought of her father, Dead 4 years now, his white coat still hanging in the hall closet because she couldn't bring herself to give it away, and felt something turn over in her chest. A strange, aching thread connecting a kindness she'd never known about to the worst and strangest night of her own life. So none of it was an accident, she said quietly. Not the building, not me. No, Vittorio said, but everything since has been. Neither of them heard the study door open a crack, nor noticed the shadow that had gathered just outside it. Salvatore Caruso stood in the corridor, one hand braced against the doorframe, listening to his son lay out a betrayal 6 months in the making, with the particular stillness of a man watching his entire understanding of his own house collapse in real time. Bruno Ricci, the man who had stood beside him at his wife's funeral, the man who had held Vittorio as an infant, the man Salvatore had trusted with more secrets than he trusted with his own sons, and the woman he had just humiliated in front of 200 people, the woman he'd called plain and heavy and nothing, was the only reason his bloodline had survived a coup he'd never even seen coming. Salvatore closed his eyes. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something close to shame settle into his chest, heavy and unfamiliar, like a coat that had never quite fit until this exact moment. Back in the ballroom, the party was already beginning its slow, uneasy unraveling, guests murmuring, drifting toward exits. The string quartet playing on with the strained cheerfulness of musicians who'd sensed the room's temperature drop and had nowhere else to be. Bruno Ricci stood near the bar with a glass he wasn't drinking, watching the study door with the careful blankness of a man doing frantic math behind a still face. He'd heard enough, filtered through hallway acoustics and half-closed doors, to understand the shape of what was happening. The woman, whoever she was, whatever her name was, knew things now, real things, the kind of things that, spoken aloud to the wrong ears, would end him. Ricci set his glass down with a hand that didn't shake, because hands that shook drew attention, and attention was the one thing he couldn't afford tonight. He caught the eye of a broad-shouldered man near the coat check, one of his own, not Salvatore's, and gave the smallest tilt of his chin toward the study doors. A second man, positioned near the estate's side entrance, caught the same signal a heartbeat later. The party was thinning now, guests filing toward their cars in 2s and 3s, the night scandal already becoming tomorrow's whispered story. No one would notice, in all that departing chaos, if one more guest quietly disappeared before she reached her car. Ricci smiled thinly at a passing couple, wished them a good night, and began making his way toward the study himself, patient, unhurried, already 3 moves ahead of a woman who had no idea the party wasn't over for her yet. Sofia stepped out of the study 20 minutes later alone. Vittorio had been pulled aside by a member of the household staff murmuring something about his father needing him immediately, and had promised he'd find her the second he was free. She told him she'd wait by the coat check. She meant it when she said it. The corridor connecting the study to the main hall was quieter than the ballroom, lined with dark portraits and the kind of hush that made her own footsteps sound too loud. She was 3/4 of the way to the coat check when a hand closed around her upper arm, firm, practiced. The grip of someone who did this often enough to know exactly how much pressure kept a person from screaming. This way, a low voice said, and before Sofia could process what was happening, a second man had appeared on her other side, and together they were steering her toward a narrow service door she hadn't noticed tucked between 2 portraits. She opened her mouth to shout. A hand clamped over it before sound could escape, and the door swung shut behind the 3 of them, cutting off the last thin thread of light and music from the hall. Stone steps led down into darkness, cold air rising to meet them, carrying the mineral smell of old wine and older rock. Sofia's mind, the part of her that had spent 11 years learning to function through fear instead of being paralyzed by it, was already working, even as her pulse hammered against her ribs. Don't fight the hand over your mouth. You'll waste air you might need. Count the steps. Note the exits. Stay upright. Stay ready. They reached the bottom, a long cellar lined with wine racks and low stone arches, lit by a single bare bulb swinging faintly from the ceiling. The hand came off her mouth. Sofia stumbled a step forward, catching herself against a wine rack, and turned to face the 2 men now blocking the only stairs back up. "You don't want to do this," she said, and was faintly surprised by how level her own voice came out. "Wasn't my idea." the larger one said, almost apologetic, which was somehow worse than if he'd sneered. Richie says you know too much, says it's a liability. I don't know anything, Sophia said, which wasn't entirely true, but true enough to sound convincing. I'm a nurse. I patched up a stranger 6 months ago. That's it. That's the whole story. Then it's a shame you were standing outside that study door tonight. The second man's voice was flatter, colder, already reaching for something at his belt. Nothing personal. Sophia's eyes flicked past them, cataloguing the room the way she'd catalogue a trauma bay. Exits, obstacle, anything within reach that could become a weapon or a delay. A wine bottle, a wrought-iron candle stand. Nothing that would win a fight against 2 armed men. But she wasn't trying to win. She was trying to survive the next 5 minutes, and every minute after that, for as long as it took. You know, she said, backing a slow step toward the wine rack, keeping her voice steady, almost conversational, if you're going to make this look like an accident, a wine cellar's a strange choice. People notice a dead body near 200 witnesses upstairs. Richie's smart enough to know that. So either he's not as smart as everyone thinks, or he hasn't actually told you the whole plan, which means you're down here taking the risk while he stays clean upstairs. The larger man's brow furrowed, just slightly, and Sophia pressed the small crack she'd found. How much is he paying you for this? Because I promise you, whatever it is, it's less than what it'll cost you if this goes wrong. Vittorio Caruso just publicly claimed me in front of 200 people. You think that story doesn't reach his father in the next 10 minutes? You think Salvatore doesn't ask where I went? It wasn't much. It wasn't a plan, but it bought her 30 more seconds of 2 men hesitating instead of moving. And 30 seconds, Sophia had learned a long time ago, could be the entire distance between a patient living and dying. It was closer to 2 minutes when Vittorio noticed. He'd returned to the coat check exactly when he promised, and found no one there. A quick sweep of the ballroom, the terrace, the powder room, nothing. The particular stillness that settled over him then was the same stillness Sophia had recognized on her kitchen table 6 months ago. The calm that came before he became something considerably more dangerous. Marco, he said, and his driver was beside him within seconds, reading the situation off his face without needing it explained. Ricci's men, Marco said grimly. 2 of them left the ballroom right after you did, cut through the east corridor. The service door behind the portraits gave under Vittorio's shoulder on the second, hit the old lock splintering out of rotted wood, and he took the stone steps 2 at a time with Marco close behind him, the cellar's cold air rushing up to meet them both. What he found at the bottom was Sophia backed against a wine rack, chin raised, talking. Actually talking. Buying time with words instead of screaming for help that wouldn't come fast enough, while 2 men closed the last few feet of distance between them. Vittorio didn't announce himself. He simply moved. The larger man went down first, Vittorio's forearm catching him across the throat before he'd even registered the sound of the stairs, momentum driving him back into a wine rack that shattered under the impact in a spray of glass and dark wine that looked for one lurching second disturbingly like blood. The second man spun, reaching for his belt, and Marco was already there, grabbing his wrist before the motion completed, twisting until the man's own weapon clattered uselessly to the stone floor. It was over in under a minute. Brutal, efficient, the kind of violence that comes from men who've had reason to practice it. Sophia stood frozen against the wine rack, adrenaline making her hands shake the exact way they had 6 months ago at her kitchen table, watching Vittorio haul the larger man up by his collar with a grip that promised there would be no negotiating. Who sent you? Vittorio said, and it wasn't a question. The man didn't answer, not with words, but his eyes cut involuntarily toward the stairs, toward the ballroom above, toward the man who'd been giving orders in that house long before Vittorio was born. That was answer enough. Vittoria's gaze found Sophia's across the wrecked cellar, checking cataloging, making sure she was whole in a way that felt less like a question and more like something he needed to confirm with his own eyes before he could think clearly again. She nodded, once, and he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the moment he found the coat check empty. Marco, he said, voice gone hard and cold as the stone around them. Get him upstairs. My father needs to hear this from Ricci's own men before Ricci has a chance to explain it away. By the time Marco dragged the larger of Ricci's men up the cellar stairs and into the study, most of the guests had gone. ushered out by staff with quiet practiced efficiency, the kind of exit a family like the Carusos had clearly choreographed before. 4 nights that went wrong. Only the inner circle remained. A handful of men Sophia didn't recognize, their faces arranged in the careful neutrality of people who had learned long ago not to react visibly to anything. Salvatore stood near the cold fireplace when Vittoria brought Sophia back in, and whatever composure he'd rebuilt in the last 20 minutes cracked the instant he saw the state of her hair loosened, color dust on the hem of her dress, the shadow of shaken nerves still visible beneath her steady expression. "What happened to her?" he said. And it wasn't directed at Sophia. It's directed at the room at his own house, at the possibility that he'd humiliated a woman in front of 200 people only to nearly get her killed within the hour. "Ricci happened," Vittoria said. "His men grabbed her the second she was alone. Would have finished the job in the wine cellar if we'd been 5 minutes slower." The color that had already been draining from Salvatore's face went the rest of the way. He turned toward the study door, just as Bruno Ricci stepped through it, summoned by one of the household men, his expression arranged into the same practiced calm he'd worn at 100 family dinners. "Salvatore." Ricci's eyes swept the room, cataloging the men, the tension, Sophia's disheveled dress, and something in his face shifted. Not panic, not yet, but the first careful recalculation of a man realizing the ground had moved. "What's happened?" "You tell me," Salvatore said, quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting. "Tell me why 2 of your men were dragging a woman into my wine cellar tonight." "I don't know what you're—" "Don't." The word cracked through the room. Salvatore crossed the space between them in 3 strides, close enough that Ricci had nowhere left to retreat to. "6 months ago, my son was shot and left for dead outside a stranger's building. I believed it was the Morettis. I mourned a war I thought was coming. And all this time it was you, sitting at my table, holding my grandchildren, planning to bury my son so your own could take his place." Ricci's composure finally broke, the mask sliding into something uglier, more desperate. "You were never going to see it," he said, voice rising. "You've been slipping for years, Salvatore, and everyone in this room knows it. I did what needed to be done for this family's future. You tried to murder my son. I tried to save this family from a leader too old to hold it together." The silence that followed was absolute. Salvatore stood very still, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone quiet in a way that carried further than shouting ever could. "I have been blind twice in one lifetime," he said. "Blind to the man closest to me who wanted my son dead for his own ambition, and blind tonight, in this very room, to the woman who saved him, who I insulted in front of everyone I know, while the real danger to this family stood at my shoulder wearing 30 years of my trust." He turned to the men flanking Ricci, and something passed between them that needed no further explanation. "Take him. This ends tonight." Ricci was still shouting something about loyalty, about legacy, as they led him from the room, but Sophia found she couldn't focus on the words, only on the strange, heavy stillness that settled over the study once the door closed behind him. The sound of a chapter of this family's history ending in a way that would never be spoken of outside these walls. Salvatore turned to Sophia last. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Sophia watched a man visibly search for words that didn't come easily to him. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the contempt he'd worn in the ballroom. "I called you plain," he said. "Heavy. Nothing. In front of 200 people, I looked at the woman who saved my son's life and called her worthless." He shook his head slowly, something like shame settling into the deep lines of his face. "I have spent my whole life believing I could read a room, read a person, in a single glance. Tonight, I have never been more wrong about anything." He reached out and took her hand, not the way he'd grabbed at her wrist earlier, not with contempt, but carefully, deliberately, the way you hold something you've only just understood the value of. "Sophia Marchetti," he said, loud enough for the remaining men in the room to hear, "you are welcome in this family, not as my son's guest, not as an afterthought I'm obligated to tolerate. You are the reason this family has a future at all, and from tonight forward, you will be treated as exactly that." Sophia didn't trust her voice enough to answer right away. She simply nodded, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight for longer than just tonight. For years, maybe. For every quiet moment she'd spent believing she was built to be overlooked. It was nearly an hour later, once the house had settled into its uneasy quiet and the last of the family's inner circle had gone, that Vittoria found her on the terrace alone, looking out over dark water she couldn't quite see the edges of. "You didn't have to stay," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I didn't want to leave." She glanced at him. "I never got to ask you something. 6 months ago, before you disappeared out my window, you looked at me like you were deciding something. What was it?" Vittoria was quiet for a moment, the same careful quiet she remembered from her kitchen table at dawn. "I was deciding," he said finally, "whether I could walk away from the only person who'd ever helped me without wanting anything back. I told myself I could. I told myself it was safer for you if I did." He turned to face her fully. "I was wrong about that too. I'd already chosen you that morning, Sophia, long before my father ever got the chance to try to take that choice away from me." The water moved quietly below them, and somewhere behind them the last lights of the ballroom dimmed for the night. Sophia stood there no longer, the woman lingering unnoticed at the edge of a room. No longer just the nurse who patched up strangers in secret and asked nothing in return, but a woman standing in the open, finally seen, finally chosen exactly where she belonged. If you made it this far, thank you. Sophia spent her whole life believing she was too plain, too invisible, too much nothing to ever be someone's reason for anything. And she was wrong. So if tonight you're feeling unseen, unwanted, not enough, remember, the right people will never need you to be smaller. They'll choose you exactly as you are.